It's Tyler DeStefano, and what I plan to do in this video is to talk about the possibility of the existence of a legend. That legend is the Pillars of Enoch. I believe I have enough circumstantial evidence to present forward and demonstrate the possibility of the existence of these pillars, and I'd also like to demonstrate, or at least talk about, how they could possibly tie into a couple of theories of mine that also extend through other theories as well. So, the Pillars of Enoch are a legend. Now, there's no credence or historical record that they actually have existed, at least to a provable mathematical standpoint. So, what are they? It's a legend of two pillars. And these are two pillars that were covered with carvings of plants and animals. Some theorize the depictions of extinct species, ones that are no longer here. One was made of brick, and the other was made of basalt or igneous rock. Now, the reason for these two pillars was to carve onto them a series of plants and animals, as well as possibly history or possibly knowledge of astronomy. But there were two because they were meant to survive two types of cataclysms, one by fire and one by water. Now, we know that the Younger Dryas impacts was a double event. There was two major periods of cataclysm that happened around 11,000 to 9,000 years ago. If you'd like to take a look more into it, Dr. Ronald Carlson has a lot of info based on the actual event of the Younger Dryas. The pillars themselves were first mentioned by Flavius Josephus. He was a Roman historian in his work known as the Antiquities of the Jews. Now, what's interesting is that the Jews also have, in their Temple of Solomon, outside of the temple are two well-known pillars. And these are known as Jason and Boaz. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing those correctly. But normally, in a standing structure, pillars or columns of these size would be meant to hold up a rotunda or possibly some kind of overhang. And this was meant to be the ceiling of whichever temple they're in. However, in the Temple of Solomon, there are two pillars located on the direct outside front of the entrance of this temple. These two pillars of Solomon are meant to demonstrate their power, their knowledge, and it's more of a representational type of pillar rather than a functional one. And that's how they see them. So, just so I can give you a picture, this is a drawing of what supposedly the pillars looked like. They were supposed to be quite large, covered in carvings, covered in intricate carvings. And then there's a couple other like different timeline things that take a look at like the Old Testament and stuff that talk about Methuselah talking with Adam for 243 years. Learning the world's history from the beginning. So these pillars were meant to demonstrate the beginning of history. And then these two pillars were written into books, and Moses supposedly had access to these books, according to Josephus. Again, this is according to a Roman historian shortly after the conquest of Judea, which was the Jewish kingdom, capitulated by the Romans in about 70 AD. And then this is a depiction of the two pillars of Jason and Boaz. Now, this left-hand one is to kind of demonstrate their size and their positioning in the front of the main entrance of the Temple of Solomon. However, this one to the right, I feel is pretty interesting in that it shows the two pillars, but they're different. So, could this be a credence as to say that, like, the pillars of Enoch and the pillars of Jason and Boaz are supposed to be representational of each other? Could it be that these pillars are meant to represent not a holding up of the temple, but a holding up of like the world and like knowledge of like plants and things like that? There's also this interesting like entwinement on here. We'll get into a little bit more of that later, but I think there might be relationship between that type of cascading other pillars and possibly the leontocephaline figure being entwined by the snake, as we demonstrated in a previous video with the mystery religion of Mithras. So Flavius Josephus was the first to mention not these pillars of Solomon, which were standing in the front of the Temple of Solomon when the temple was destroyed. He specifically mentions the pillars that were older than those that were accessed by Moses. So here's the exact text from the Antiquities of the Jews, which was written in approximately 93 to 94 AD, approximately 20 years after the conquest of Judea. So in Book 1, Chapter 2, very early on in his histories, to demonstrate the earliness of this type of knowledge, Book 1, Chapter 2 of the Antiquities of the Jews by Flavius Josephus, they were also the inventors of that. That being a peculiar sort of wisdom, which is concerned with the heavenly bodies and their order. So, could that have something to do with astronomy? Maybe. And their intentions might not be lost before they were sufficiently known. AKA, that knowledge they knew was not complete. They only had a partial picture, and they were trying to preserve as much knowledge as they could. Upon Adam's prediction that the world was to be destroyed at one time by the force of fire and at another time by the violence and quantity of water. So, this is a specific, in my mind, a specific reference to the possibility of the Younger Dryas impacts, because we know that there was a massive changeover in terms of the landscape of the climate, and that it's possible that it was some kind of massive low air burst explosion, possibly from some type of meteorite or asteroid. Now, the water one obviously relates to the legend of the flood, but I believe that the legend of the flood and the Younger Dryas impact is pretty clear in that there was an ice age, and then the Younger Dryas happened, and now there's no ice, and there was a massive extinction event. And where did all the ice go? It melted, and then that made more water, and then that became the flood. However, Adam is still supposedly a legend, not an actual figure. Therefore, this is described as a legend and not a historical account. They made two pillars, the one of brick and the other of stone. They inscribed their discoveries on them both. In that the case the pillar of brick be destroyed by the flood, the pillar of stone might remain and exhibit the discoveries to mankind. And also inform them that there was another pillar of brick erected by them. Now this remains in the land of Syria today. Now, this is a sophisticated demonstration of the preservation of knowledge. These pillars, if correct, if this history is correct, there was a large amount of knowledge concerned about astronomy that they knew was important, that they wanted to preserve, that they chose to preserve. And not only did they choose to preserve it, they chose to preserve it in very specific ways that had to do with their legends and histories. So, is this a legend of a legend, or could there possibly be some rooting in reality? Now, he says that these were in the land of Syriad. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, we're going to describe the continuation of this type of preservation of knowledge in the form of Trajan's column, which I believe was an adopted idea from this idea of these pillars of knowledge from Flavius Josephus, from the Romans. Trajan, the emperor, had a massive column built, a standing pillar structure that was enwrapped in the history of his conquest of the Dacian Wars. So it was completed in 113 AD. It stands 35 meters tall. It's 115 feet. It is massive. It's to commemorate the Dacian Wars. Those wars took place between 101 and 106 AD. And then after that, they decided to put together a column which took 3 to 5 years to complete. And it still stands in Rome today, but I'll demonstrate that in a little bit. It's a spiral column of history starting from the top and working down. There's 2,662 figures in total in 115 scenes. This is to demonstrate how stone was used as a history with remarkable detail. And then also, so you know, beneath the column, in the bottom, is Trajan's ashes. So this column is not only a preservation and a type of knowledge carrier, but it's also a tomb. And allegedly, this column of Trajan is the first historical column of its kind. So, we know that the column was built in 1113, or completed in 1113. We know that Flavius Josephus talked about historical columns or pillars 20 years prior. It's very likely that Emperor Trajan was told about the histories of the Jews after the conquest of Judea, because this would still be all very fresh. It would still be very fresh. Think about like our time now. It would be the equivalent of like if Judea had fallen at the end of the Vietnam War, and then the history of that entire region of the planet was freshly known and written in histories 20 years later in the 90s. And then 20 years later, there's another column that gets erected. This is a single lifetime of people. There would have been somebody who had been born who would have seen all of these events take place in their lifetime. So this is not to say that like this is something that came out of the blue. I believe that Trajan knew about the antiquities of the Jews. He saw that the preservation of knowledge in a stone pillar was a good idea. And he decided to adopt that idea for himself. And then he decided to make his history on this particular column. And I think this demonstrates how particular knowledge, while not an exact one-to-one copy, can be translated across different times of civilizations. And just like poetry, it rhymes. So my theory is that you have the Pillars of Enoch, and then those are discovered by somebody like Moses, or possibly some other ancient patriarchal figure of the Jews or the Egyptians. And then that knowledge is used to make Jason and Boaz as a representation of these pillars of knowledge. And we still use the phrase pillars of knowledge to this day. Then, after Judea is conquested and the temple is destroyed, all of that knowledge is second-handedly written down by their new conquerors, the Romans. Then, all of this knowledge is reinterpreted by the Romans themselves, who then take this knowledge and act as if it is their own. They have conquered these people, they take all of their history and their knowledge, and then they use it to craft themselves the narrative of the emerging Rome that we see. So, I believe that this is a pretty easy of a timeline to grasp, and I believe that this is a clear demonstration of how knowledge passes along these civilizations. So let's take a look. This is actually Trajan's column here. You can see a bust of him standing, or a statue of him standing at the top. And this is still centered in Rome. You can see that the column spirals all the way down. Again, this is 115 feet tall. You can see how big some of the people are towards the bottom. It's an actual massive monument. And it still stands today, which just proves how useful a column is at preserving this type of knowledge. Now, to take a little bit closer of a look, we can see how this story winds down in a single stretch throughout this column. This is a cross section of the inside showing that there is multiple sections of it that all scale up, and that there's a staircase on the inside. This is a gigantic building project. A closer look will show you the different sections of the divisions of the Dacian Wars, as well as Trajan's history himself. So this, I think, is interesting to show because just as we saw with the cult of Mithras and the Leontocephaline, the winding and the top-down winding of the beginnings to the endings of history could have some relationship between this column and the lion-headed, snake-enwrapped figure that could possibly show the history of all of mankind, where that snake enwrapping is not a history of this Dacian Wars, it's the history of the precession of the equinox, as I described earlier. But this is just to show you a bit of a close-up. If you look really closely on some of these pictures, you can see how remarkably detailed they are. There's full-bodied, figured carvings all throughout. More than 2,600 of them. And if you look even closer, when it was fully made, it would have been freshly painted. And they would have had all of these tiny, tiny little metal spears held by each one of these little figures in the war scenes. It's absolutely detailed and one of the greatest examples of a historical monument that's ever been made. Now, let's get back to the land of Syriad, because that's where Flavius Josephus describes these pillars. I believe Syriad could be Egypt because of a few reasons. So Sirius is one of the brightest stars in the sky. Its heliacal rising, coincides with the Nile's regular flooding. And if you've studied Egypt, you'll know that the Nile was ultra important to them. Its flooding was really consistent and really regular. So the timing marker to use it would have been important as well. Now, this was also the start of the Egyptian New Year. The pyramids thought to be dated for like 2,600 to 2,500 BC, but I think you could easily rewrite that by saying that you know that Sirius could be observed directly rising above the Great Pyramid, approximately 3,000 to 2,800 BC. So that disconnect right there already demonstrates that the timeline could possibly be rewritten. And then I have a little bit more to go further with that also. But could Syriad be the land of Sirius? And could the land of Sirius be described as Egypt, since Sirius was such an important star? It would be the equivalent of, like, their most prominent star, besides for the North Star for navigation. This is just a quick picture. This doesn't show anything actual, but it's just a fun picture just to show what a star would look like rising over the Great Pyramid. This is actually the wrong direction also. If you know the Sphinx faces east, you'd want to be standing on the west side of the pyramid to watch Sirius rise over the east. Now, the rising of Sirius rewriting the timeline is really interesting because we know that the heavens move, as described in my previous video of the precession of the equinoxes. We know that the equinox changes its position every single year. It moves 1 degree in the sky backwards through the zodiac every 72 years. And it's a process where the heavens in their entirety spin along the axis of the Earth according to the Earth's wobble. The full rotation takes 25,920 years, which means Sirius will rise again directly over the Great Pyramid. And it has done so before. Before the approximate rising of Sirius over 3000 BC to 2800 BC, the last time it rose over Sirius, directly over the Great Pyramid, was 9300 BC. And I think that this could demonstrate that the pyramids are far older than we think, and that it's possible that they were constructed directly after the Younger Dryas impacts, as to maintain their knowledge as a history school. This is another legend, but it's actually a partial historical account also. So this is where we got to kind of take a look into the historical account and delineate where we know things have happened and where we have to kind of guess because we don't actually know. So this is the legend of Solon of Greece, claimed by Herodotus and Plato to have visited Egypt, where he was shown many things. Solon is known as the lawmaker. He was somebody who, like Hammurabi, was introduced into the Grecian states. And he came up with a lot of really good rulings as to how the Greek society should be run. He was actually around even before Pythagoras. So I'm wondering if Solon, in his trip to Egypt, could have been given tons of knowledge, which were then also passed along to other great minds, such as Plato, Socrates, Pythagoras, and others. In Plato's Timaeus and Critias, I apologize again if I'm pronouncing things wrong, he claims Solon went to the city of Sais and became faced with inscriptions of the floods, plural, just like multiple Younger Dryas impacts, and civilizations long forgotten. In the text, they possibly describe that these were on stone, possibly pillars. Manly P. Hall, the Order of the early 1900s, in his lecture of The Mystery of Atlantis, Evidence from Greece and Egypt, from 1958, claims Solon was actually presented with a pillar made of mysterious metal, which detailed the catastrophe, not just the flood, but a actual catastrophe, which caused the flood. There might be a relation to like Sodom and Gomorrah. This could possibly all tie together. The city of Sais was claimed to be on the Nile Delta, and his mission was to consolidate histories. This is going to be shortly after the return of the Jews and the building of their temple from Babylon. I believe that was the Neo-Assyrian Empire. I get those a little bit mixed up, but I'll actually make a better video with the timeline later. But the reason that he was sent to Egypt or had gone is because they had a timeline of their history, of the Greek history. And he was trying to consolidate that with the Egyptian timeline, which is much, much longer. So what these two were trying to do was to form together a coalition of interdependent trade where these two societies could get along, and the best way they could do that is to show that they had similar backgrounds. And they're in similar areas, the eastern part of the Mediterranean. So there is some need there as to try to rebuild society, especially if your knowledge was lost. The Egyptian priests claim the Greek islands were invaded by Atlantis 9,000 years prior to the time of Solon. And this lines up perfectly with the second of the Younger Dryas impacts of 9,600 BC. So, as a quick reminder, there are nearly zero inscriptions or hieroglyphics depicting the construction of the pyramids. We know that they have their histories. We know that they saved knowledge of almost everything they could of the stars, of tons of different inscriptions, but not the pyramids. So, is it possible that the pyramids were made in a time long before they even decided to start making hieroglyphs? Is it possible that the pyramids could have been constructed right after 9600 BC, when whoever was the preeminent civilization at the time was wiped out or massively reduced in scale? They had to leave their homeland, invade somewhere else, the Greek islands, and possibly Egypt, and then construct the pyramid around 9300 BC to coincide with the Sirius rising as a demonstration of their knowledge of the land. That way they can lay claim to all of Egypt and the Nile itself. This is just a couple of pictures of Solon, so just a bust or recreation here. I just figured I'd show him. But what's also interesting is that he is shown holding this long rod, and I believe that might have relation to the rod shown into Mithras and the Leontocephaline figure, wherein that rod is a representation of his command and authority of the knowledge of the heavens, the rod being the earthly axis, the axis on which all the heavens move. So by claiming the rod, he symbolically claims control over the heavens. And then this is just a little bit of a map showing some of the areas. They believe Syriad could be Heliopolis, and that could be very, very close to or the location of where these pillars are. And that's essentially Giza, or at least the area, roughly. Possible locations of these pillars. There's a citation needed for this. I can't remember exactly where I heard it from, but I know that I heard somebody speak about this, or it was written down and I read it somewhere. I'd love to know if somebody can find this exact quote. There's a legend that says that the pillars themselves, the Pillars of Enoch, were located on an island, on a lake, that was in an underground chamber, directly below the Great Pyramid. And that the true purpose of the Great Pyramid is a storehouse for ancient knowledge and a secretive initiatory mystery school that has maintained this knowledge of the flood, of the procession, of all of their histories. And as we know, if anybody has studied the Great Pyramid, we do know that there is indeed a path that leads straight down from the subterranean chamber, whose purpose is unknown, and is now flooded. Water has come up from underneath the bottom of the pyramid and filled this subterranean chamber. Also, recent ground scans revealed there could be some type of chamber or structure that descends below the Great Pyramid. So let me just show you here. This is a cross-section of the Great Pyramid showing the King's Chamber, Queen's Chamber, and then these shafts and descending passages which lead to this underground subterranean chamber. Now, if you take a look, you'll notice that there is a shaft that goes straight down. And I believe that it's possible that this legend could be true, wherein the pyramid was put directly above some kind of subterranean chamber, which housed some kind of knowledge, which was protected by this chamber in the event of some kind of major catastrophe on the Earth's surface. And this is just to show the size, so that way you don't think that it's like a tiny cave that you'd have to squeeze in. This is large enough that if they had set up scaffolding, they could have descended. Also, just as a relation to all of what we're talking about, and it kind of lines up in the timeline, would be the Sumerian Kings list. It's an inscribed stone on a square of all four faces. Not exactly a cylinder or a pillar, but it demonstrates history's carving in stone on a vertical style stone. Eight kings ruled over a series of 5 cities, demonstrating history, preservation, displacement of population, as well as a preservation of knowledge. After the first 8 kings, the inscription reads, "Then the flood swept over," before restarting history once again. After the flood, it brings us down to shorter timelines for these kings to have ruled, of dynasties of Uruk and Ur, which were real cities. So this is where I'm trying to get with this whole video. Where does the legend end, and where does history actually begin? I believe just because we don't have explicit, written out in English or some kind of easily translatable inscription that says there was a flood at this exact time and then we went here and then we went here, I believe you can extrapolate the possibility that this could have happened. And knowing that the Younger Dryas impact actually did happen and how impactful it was on the entire planet, I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that if there was some kind of civilization, that they would have been rocked really hard by this type of cataclysm. They would have moved. They would have tried to keep their knowledge, and they would have tried to preserve that knowledge and demonstrate it to the next sets of people that come from them. So this is just a depiction of the Sumerian kings list. It's a 4-sided pillar or vertical column. And then this is the exact inscription that says, "The flood swept over the land." And after the flood swept over the land, the kingship had descended from heaven for a second time. Kish or Cush became the seat of the kingship. Now, descended from heaven, a lot of people would like to assume that that would mean something like Anunnaki or aliens or something coming from like the sky. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's not something that directly descends from heaven. It is the authority to rule over all the heavens, including the earth, that is their righteous authority. Just as he is symbolically in control of the heavens with the rod, so too does that authority come from the heavens, not an alien spaceship. Now, this is a real life connection. This is Göbekli Tepe. We know that this is a site that is dated to the approximate time of the Younger Dryas impacts. It features carvings of plants and animals in stone columns, and possibly the signs of the zodiac. And this site is presumed to possibly be also intentionally buried. The carvings on all of the things in Göbekli Tepe are primarily relief carvings. Relief carvings are set on the outside of the stone, not carved into it or pounded into a flat-facing rock. This is where you would carve in the 3D shape and then pound away all the stone on the outside of it. This is a more complicated style of carving. It's much more complicated to try to make this 3D object stand out from the stone rather than carve what you were trying to inscribe into the stone. It's much more challenging. It takes a lot of more work. And it also is more time consuming. So if there was something where you had to put all of these histories together and make it really, really quick and haphazard, then we might expect, or if you were a more primitive civilization, then you would expect to have more primitive style carvings. But this level of sophistication shows that they had relief carvings, which means that before you can master relief carvings, you must master inscription carving. Because the only way to make a relief carving is from an inscription that then is pounded away in a 3D shape. This shows that Göbekli Tepe has a level of sophistication, which means that there is history before Göbekli Tepe. There's people who understood how to quarry, transport, design, stack, carve, arrange, and rearrange stone in a very, very sophisticated way. Now, there's also tons still left to uncover. We only have like a tiny, tiny bit of Göbekli Tepe actually done. So there has to be more work done, and there could be even more historical accounts or other carvings below. Now, if these people who made Göbekli Tepe were this sophisticated, I believe that it's possible that they could have built something that resembles these two pillars. It might not be as detailed or large as they were described in the legends, but I believe it's very possible that if you can build Göbekli Tepe, you can build two other pillars somewhere else that are really similar, that show similar things, that are for a similar purpose, that are of a similar shape and size, and have similar styles on them, aka these relief carvings. So let's take a look at some of these Göbekli Tepe ones. These are real, so let's not try to speculate as to, oh, are these the Pillars of Enoch or are they not? I'm just showing you the actual pillars themselves. These ones are at Göbekli Tepe, and we know for a fact that they correlate to the actual timeline that I'm trying to demonstrate. So you can see the size of them here. Very, very tall. And there's massive amounts of them. You can see that all these pillars also have the inscriptions carved along them. So let's take a look at some more. Pillar 43 is probably one of the most popular ones. This one shows these birds in flight. I believe that there could also be relation to like the handbags of the Anunnaki, which I actually believe is the sun rising over the horizon. And I believe that's what the bag is, that they are grasping the sun over the horizon and pulling it upward. Just like how the rod symbolizes the axis of the heavens, so too could this bag mean the rising of the sun. Then there's these intricate bird carvings, possible vultures. This scorpion is interesting because it is anatomically correct with its 8 legs instead of 6 like an arachnid would have. And also that Scorpio is a sign of the zodiac. So are there more pillars that will show more signs of the zodiac? I don't know. This one on the right is really intricate. You can see how pronounced of a relief carving this is. This means that all of this would have been solid stone that had to have been pounded away in this perfect 3D shape. There's more 3D carvings as well. These ones are pounded into the side, but you also have standalone ones. Standalone humanoid figures, standalone bird figures, standalone boar figures. Lots and lots of different types. So if they thought that these species could go extinct, wouldn't you want to know that they existed? Menagerie of birds, some large build walking style birds, possibly like emus, dodos, maybe something like that, maybe something that is extinct. There looks to be what could be a water buffalo. There looks to be what could be a longer legged walking style bird, maybe a crane or a flamingo of sorts. This pillar here shows a lot of carvings on them. Menagerie of birds, flying birds, beasts of the land, that kind of thing. A bunch of different stuff. And then fish in the water, it looks like, possibly. So this one, I think, is actually probably the most interesting in relation to the Pillars of Enoch, in that this one is a pillar covered in plants and animals, or at least animals. But that ties into the legend. Now, this one here I want to show as a relief carving of ancient Egypt. This is a relief carving, but it's set into the stone, kind of. It's like a halfway in between a relief carving and an inscription carving, where an inscription, like you see on this right-hand side, would just be carved in and the shape relayed. This one actually has like the shapes of these birds and the beetle sticking out a little bit. But you'll see that like with Göbekli Tepe, they're completely carved out, which means all of the surrounding remaining stone had to be pounded away. Why do we have Egyptian carvings that are dated to be about 2000 BC as less sophisticated carving technique? I understand that, it's finer, but the technique is not as refined. That we have carved technique style that's 8,000 years older than the oldest portions of Egypt, that's more advanced. This is a direct demonstration of this advanced technology and knowledge. Now, you also see this menagerie of birds. What I wanted to show here is that this loincloth is actually this loincloth piece here, and that this pillar may be like a person because of these arms that reach out, these hands, possibly a belt. So this could show that there was some kind of, if somebody had a patterned repeating belt, that maybe they had metallurgy, maybe they had agriculture because you have to farm cows, or maybe they hunted, but who knows. What I'm saying is that these are attributed to hunter-gatherer humans. People that supposedly made like flint arrowheads also made these detailed inscription and relief carvings? I don't think so. And even if they did, that just goes to show that hunter-gatherers were much more advanced at that time than we presume. So, what are my conclusions? I believe that the Pillars of Enoch, or at least something similar, existed at some time. I believe that there's enough circumstantial evidence to give credence to the idea of these columns and the legend of their creators. I believe it's possible that the pyramids are far older than we suppose. I believe that sites like Göbekli Tepe and the pyramids of Giza demonstrate an attempt to encode knowledge onto something permanent in a symbolic way. I believe that there was knowledge of these Younger Dryas impact events and their cataclysm, and I believe mainstream archaeology is wrong, and Göbekli Tepe must be fully excavated. It's only been about 5% so I believe once we actually uncover more of Göbekli Tepe, then we'll be able to kind of put a little bit more of this history together. But as of now, I'm just trying to demonstrate how all of these different types of carvings, pillars, they all share relationship to this history, which I believe is real. Thank you.